Thank you, Ron. So I'm Don Willits, and I'm here to talk about secure Power Platform development. I work in an org that focuses on securing Microsoft information assets, so I'm not actually in the Power Platform product group. But along with a really great V team for the last few years, we've been driving security features into the product. Some of these are net new that we've come up with. Others are ones the product group knew they needed to have on the roadmap or had on the roadmap, and we help prioritize them accordingly. And I'd like to talk about some of the exciting features that we've helped drive that were released this year. So Power Platform is included with your M365 license, and it's tightly integrated with an Office, SharePoint, and Teams. But you can't lock down this integration from within, say, a SharePoint web admin site or within your Office admin consoles. You have to go directly to the Power Platform Admin Center in order to lock down the Power Platform tenant. So after briefly going over the architecture, we're going to focus on the admin center in particular because it is your first and best line of defense to secure Power Platform development. Fully 1/3 of the features in Charles Lamina's Ignite keynote session in March were ones that we helped drive into the product group, and the last of these just rolled in public preview last week. So there's a lot of features we've collaborated with the product group on, but the ones in the Power Platform Admin Center I think are the ones that are probably going to have the biggest impact and be the most visible for you in terms of locking down your overall tenant. I also want to talk about how we're looking at Power Platform development internally in terms of the Microsoft Secure Development Lifecycle. And we've used this for the better part of 20 years now, as platforms and technologies evolve, so has the SDL. I'll discuss how we're adapting it to the Power Platform's low-code, no-code paradigm. Until now, a lot of this work has only been available internally, or we shared it on a case-by-case basis through account teams or with users individually. And this is the first time we've released it publicly. There's some parts of it we're still vetting internally as it's evolving as well. So there are 4 legs to the Microsoft Power Platform: Power Apps, Power Automate, Power Virtual Agents, and Power BI. Power BI is out of scope for this discussion. Each tenant contains multiple environments. An environment is a container for your apps, flows, and chatbots. You would use the admin center to administer either individual environments or all environments in the tenant at once. Some environments are shared across a large population enterprise, which is to say a large set of users in your enterprise can create apps, flows, and chatbots. Others are locked down to a smaller pool of developers and/or users. Power Apps itself is a set of apps, services, and connectors, as well as a data platform that allows you to do rapid development. Designer provides guardrails, allowing you to create low-code, no-code applications, whether you're using it for an enterprise line of business application or your own personal productivity. So you can quickly build apps to connect to data stored either in the underlying data platform known as Dataverse or in other online and on-premises data sources such as SharePoint, Dynamics, SQL Server, and so on. We want to distinguish between the notion of a connector and a connection. A connector is a generic proxy or a wrapper around a web service endpoint that allows the underlying service to talk to apps and flows. Connectors provide a way so you can create an instance of that connector to a specific endpoint and then leverage a set of pre-built actions for that endpoint. We call the instance of connector a connection, which can be reused across apps and flows, sometimes whether you know it or not, and we'll discuss oversharing shortly. So in this particular diagram, we have a sample app that's connected to a specific SharePoint site and a specific Excel workbook. In the flow, we have basically 2 connections that are transferring data between 2 SQL servers. So right now we have well over 100 connectors from Microsoft services and endpoints and 450 connectors to non-Microsoft services and endpoints, and that number seems to be growing almost on a daily basis. Instances of Power Automate are called flows, and this is a service you can use to automate repetitive tasks. It's built on top of Azure Logic Apps, but we're not going to talk about that in this conversation. It does provide a way for you to create low-code, no-code implementation of Logic Apps that resembles a flowchart. Power Virtual Agents let you create powerful chatbots and can answer questions posed by your customers and other employees or visitors to your website. It uses back-end machine learning to parse questions and match them with predefined answers. You simply configure your keywords and the answer, and the built-in machine learning takes care of the rest. You can link a chatbot or flow to, you can link a chatbot to flows as well as skills defined in the Microsoft Bot Framework. And the default authentication for chatbots is anonymous, as the primary use case is to service first-tier customer support. Each environment may or may not have an instance of Dataverse. Dataverse is a wraparound SQL server and has been the heart of Dynamics 365 for some time. It lets you securely store and manage your data that's used by your applications. Model-driven apps are created based on a Dataverse table and provide strong guardrails to protect your data. And you can query the Dataverse using Power Query. There's some additional features that are out of scope for this conversation, which includes Power Apps portals, AI Builder, custom connectors, and a nifty tool called Portals Checker. And so links to all of these are in the handout that Ron prepared and will also be in the YouTube video associated with this recording. So each environment is associated with a data loss prevention policy. These policies define the available connectors and their behavior within that environment. And at Microsoft, we have three main DLP policies to reduce risk and oversharing data from connectors. Our ultra low risk DLP policy has the bare minimum connectors needed by Power Platform and a few additional connectors for approvals, notifications, and so on. We do not include any connectors from the non-Microsoft service and endpoints in our ultra low policy. And this is the default policy for any net new environments that are created in the tenant, and we've also applied it to the default environment. Every tenant will have a default environment, which is typically available to every user in your enterprise, and it's important to lock this down. If you've been granted access to other environments, you can isolate your work accordingly. These custom environments typically also use the ultra-low policy or a modification if they need additional connectors or behavior. More importantly, we customize the access control settings that will minimize the number of users who can use this custom environment to create or update apps and flows. So these objects can be shared more broadly than just the environment membership, but in order to modify them, you have to be a member of this environment or else you can't touch them. So this minimizes the chance that connections might be reused, along with other security benefits just from isolation. For our low-risk policy, we begin adding more Microsoft published connectors, although we exclude anything that includes a relational database. For our medium-risk policy, we add connectors for online and on-premise relational databases, but still no connectors from non-Microsoft services. Again, for that, we'd create a custom policy and associate with a custom environment. There's one connector I added there at the bottom right corner, Power Apps for admins, and this is one of three connectors you can use to automate administration of your tenant. The connector will use your credentials, determine if you're an admin, and if you're not an admin, you're really very limited in what you can do. Within a given connector policy, you can bucketize things as either business, non-business, or blocked. Originally, it was just business and non-business. And the premise was you could not build an app or flow that uses connectors from both classifications. Whoops, sorry, way too fast. This restriction breaks down though with the HTTP with Azure AD or HTTP webhook connectors if they're classified in the business bucket. These connectors can access non-business endpoints easily since the connector is a thin wrapper around a web service endpoint. So we only allow these HTTP connectors in our medium risk policy, but now with a new feature called endpoint filtering, we can reduce the risk of these connectors and consider moving them to our ultra low or low policies as needed. Our V team helped drive the creation of the blocked bucket. From the screenshot below, you can see that our ultra low risk DLP policy has only 22 connectors that are classified as business, and everything else, first or third party, is classified as blocked. And we pretty much just use business and block just to keep things simple. We've had to deal with explosive viral adoption within our tenant. Each month we have over 100,000 monthly active users and some between 1 million and 1.5 million distinct sessions. This far exceeds any other Power Platform tenant, and as you can see from the graphs, it's continuously growing. Sometimes it seems almost exponentially. We had to build tooling that we call IT glue because our tenant has always been the largest by at least an order of magnitude, typically 2. We've also used this as an opportunity to collaborate with the product group to drive new features so you don't have to build that glue yourself. This allows for tightly coupled improvements in both governance and security. And as time goes on, we keep retiring IT glue. Now, a lot of our IT glue is also for internal Microsoft processes that would be specific to us, and your own enterprise would have your own equivalent processes. So our IT glue isn't just security and governance, but the parts that I'll be talking about are focused specifically on those two areas. Because of the growth of our tenant and the size of our tenant, we've always been a good stress test for the Power Platform Admin Center, and have semi-continuously been driving scalability improvements as a result. So how did we lock down our tenant? Well, our journey began with tenant inventory. Admin APIs like Git flows had a built-in limitation of 100,000 rows. Natively within Azure Logic apps, this was a reasonable number, but in the viral adoption, low-code, no-code environment Power Automate, it became something we bumped up against very quickly as we tried to build reporting to tell us what was going on in our tenant. There was also throttling limits that prevented how much data could be returned, as well as latency issues that also delayed how fast an API returned data. It was around this time that version 1 of the Power Platform Center of Excellence kit was released, which we sometimes call the COE starter kit or toolkit. And we had a lot of input in terms based on the IT glue we'd already built in terms of what the initial version of the starter kit could contain. And we spent a lot of time adapting it to our own environment. There were some limitations due to scalability issues. So with typical customer environments, or the COE toolkit works just fine, but with ours, with all the viral adoption, but most importantly, our production tenant was originally used for testing, so we had a lot of overhead in terms of the number of environments, apps, flows, and later on chatbots. So the COE toolkit's gone far beyond anything we originally expected or asked for. In parallel, the Power Platform Center was one of our focuses, and one of the things that we wanted to be able to do was send out a mail that would say, "Welcome to the revolution. We're glad you're using Power Platform. Here's a few things you should know to get started." This helped us enable the success of our developers, as well as reduce first-tier customer support questions. So we combined promoting best practices for Power Platform development in conjunction with building enthusiasm for its adoption. But with this ability to notify developers to create net new objects, we can also look for behavior that can incur risk. We had just developed the ultra low risk policy, and it took time to get users trained to use the shared environments that we created for low and medium policies. To migrate their work into corresponding shared environments, we request the creation of a net new environment. This resulted in a second email that we send out as necessary and politely telling the maker creating the object that, we're really glad you're using the Power Platform. What you're doing it and where you're doing it, though, can incur some risk. Here's how you fix it. You have 30 days to do so, or we archive your object, zip it up to you, send it to you, and remove it from this environment. So we try to be really nice about it, but at the same time, we wanted to be able to manage the risk and make sure that our environments were as low risk as possible. We needed fine-grained control over connectors, though, and we helped write significant improvements that I'll present here shortly. We'll start with connector action blocking. Connector actions describe the behaviors of a connector. We now have the ability to block these actions. In the case here, I'm showing the online help topic for the SharePoint connector, and the send an HTTP request to SharePoint action is one that we'd want to lock down. Without this, anyone using a specific SharePoint connection has access to the entire SharePoint REST API using the credentials of the dev who created the connection. So we wanted to protect the developer from accidentally doing anything that could have negative consequences to the site. And at times, this connection may be available for reuse by others who would otherwise not have the same permissions on that site. If someone genuinely needs to create an app or flow that would be modified in a SharePoint site, we'd once again create a custom environment for them, a custom policy, and let them do what they need to do for their business needs. Twitter makes a really good example. This is a third-party connector that we would not put in our ultra-low policy. However, by blocking a post-to-tweet and retweet actions, the connector now poses low risk of someone posting to Twitter in automated fashion. So if a developer does require this action for a legitimate business case, then we can again create a new environment with a customized policy. But you also note there at the bottom, you can block net new actions by default as this connector is being updated over time. So this ensures that you don't have any new or surprising actions slipping into production without your awareness. I gotta say, I love endpoint filtering. This is another feature that's come out this year, and this gives us the ability to configure an ordered list of endpoint patterns to allow or deny. It does this by supporting pattern matching, IP addresses, and domain names in the filters. Like connection action blocking, endpoint filtering allows you to place specific controls on which domains are allowed, either for a specific environment or tenant-wide. In this example, you can use filtering to govern usage of specific SQL Server instances. Depending on the sensitivity of the data stored on the various servers, you can allow access to some SQL Server endpoints and deny access to others. This has been one of the things that we've been locking down since this feature was released. Custom connectors are generic web service proxies for endpoints that we don't ship with the platform. So you typically create this to access your own web service endpoints within your enterprise or your partners. It's important to include these in your DLP policies, but until recently, this could only be done through PowerShell. Now there's a new step when you create or update an existing policy that allows you to configure custom connectors. You can use a wildcard to define the rule or to enumerate specific endpoints for the custom connector and be able to fine-tune your DLP policy accordingly. Some time ago, we took a look at our tenant and discovered several hundred inbound connections and only a few outbound connections. These were coming from other Power Platform tenants. 75% of the inbound connections to Microsoft Tenant were in fact tenants that advertise itself as an athletic department of a Division I university. Didn't sound too kosher. Sounded pretty suspicious, in fact. Is this a hacker disguising the entry point or something else? Turns out we had a tester in Microsoft who is an athlete from that university, and they created a demo tenant for testing connections into our production tenant. We promptly had a conversation about the value of not doing testing in a production tenant. All the outbound connections were to Microsoft partners who need to exchange data. And now you can explicitly configure whether to allow or deny inbound and outbound connections with other Power Platform tenants. Unlike endpoint filtering, keep trying to move to the wrong slide. Unlike endpoint filtering, this is not an ordered list. In this case, I've created 3 rules. The first one is a rule that blocks anything that's coming inbound or outbound. And then I create a second rule that allows both inbound and outbound connections with a tenant ID that starts with the number 7. And I created a third rule that only allows outbound connections to other tenants with a tenant ID that starts with the number 4. Now, finding the tenant ID has sometimes been a little challenging. You figure where it is. You actually have to go to the Azure portal and look at the Active Azure Directory Overview tab, and then you'll see the tenant ID there as I've shown here in the lower right corner. Finally, we come to data export to data lake. I've been hinting at this for much of the talk, and the ability to get tenant inventory directly from the Power Platform API without throttling or latency restrictions is critical to our governance and security as well as other unrelated business processes. Currently, this is in preview and will allow us to retire some of our IT glue and allow you to build your own tenant inventory without having to create that glue. The COE toolkit did provide an alternative for most of our customers, but it didn't scale to a tenant our size. With this bring your own data lake feature, we will over time have an increasingly detailed ability to generate tenant inventory and retire our corresponding IT glue. It won't go away entirely though, because we integrate with other data sources not shown here, such as Azure Active Directory to follow nested security groups. The data lake that is populated by this feature is read-only, so we'll copy this into a separate read-write data lake and use that as a basis for our governance and security tooling, because we can integrate that data lake with other data sources that we require. So now that we've locked down our tenant, we want to look at how do you lock down or secure individual apps and flows, and what are the things that you would look for. I'm pivoting this partly off the secure development lifecycle and partly not. A couple of years ago, I did create some SDL guidance for our internal line of business process for the SDL. And a lot of that has been sprinkled into this particular presentation and the things that I'm mentioning and talking about. So we use the SDL as one of many, many release gates before releasing products and services, either externally or internally. And so we continue to fine tune it over time. And the low code, no code paradigm introduces some challenges to the SDL that previous technologies haven't. For example, encrypt in transit, encrypt at rest are handled for you automatically within the platform. So many of the controls in the SDL are also embedded within the platform itself. SDL validation ranges from self-attestation to formal security review. Pen testing is not as applicable in this case because you'd be testing the platform, not the apps, flows, and chatbots directly. So in the context of our internal line of business, we look at data classification. We have additional SDL controls that pivot off of sensitivity labels that are supported either within Office or in containers like SharePoint. These sensitivity labels are defined by the Office 365 Security and Compliance Center, and it also defines policies for each label. For example, you could require highly confidential labeled content must be encrypted. So, so this raises some questions. If I'm pulling data from a highly confidential SharePoint site, do I want to send it to a destination that is lower classification or no classification? If I have a Word document that is classified public, but it lives in a confidential SharePoint site container, which label do I use for deciding whether or not this data should move or not? Do I use the public label or do I use the confidential label? So these are the things that anyone can miss, not just Power Platform developers, but they are things that seem to bubble to the surface a little bit with Power Platform more so than elsewhere. Now, one of the things that sensitivity labels give you is, for example, if I take a Word document and I encrypt it as highly confidential or label as highly confidential and it's only can be opened by full-time employees at Microsoft, when it goes to a vendor or a non-Microsoft employee, Word just won't open the document and protect it. So this kind of sensitivity label awareness and what we get for free built into Word and SharePoint and what we don't elsewhere is something we have to consider when we're doing Power Platform development. This slide and the next one poses questions that we should ask for a security review or even deciding if an SDL security review is necessary. Some of this is metadata you can obtain through the admin connectors and tenant inventory, but some of it you'll have to go and query Azure AD or understand your company's policy around Azure B2B guests, or even prompt the user directly for answers to these questions. We're going to talk about implicit connection sharing here in a few moments. There are several scenarios, oops, too many again. There are several scenarios in this list that touch on oversharing. As mentioned before, a properly configured admin center, especially your connector policies and configurations, your first and best line of defense to prevent developers from unintentional consequences that result in oversharing. We're coming up with some criteria to help determine when and how much of a security assessment might be required. So we start this by scoping objects with scoping the Power Platform objects with a combination of DLP policy, sample set of connectors that we use in each policy, sensitivity labels, and number of users for app flows and chatbots. We're using a simple t-shirt costing model to estimate the effort that should go into the assessment. The number of users I show here on this slide is somewhat arbitrary. We did a preliminary analysis on connector usage to inform this table. As we further develop our IT glue and associated reporting, this number will almost certainly change. I personally suspect it will become a range more so than a hard stop. If you reuse this approach to evaluate security assessments or risk in your own tenant, you'll want to probably tweak it for your own business needs. So we're just presenting this as an example of how to evaluate risk. And as we're vetting this and incorporating it to our own processes and tooling, this is, as I put on the screen, a work in progress. On this table, we once again use data classification, but in this case using SharePoint connector as key criteria instead of a DLP policy. We're calling out the difference between an app or flow that uses just a SharePoint connector or an app or flow that uses multiple connectors. We did some analysis on our tenant, and we found that 12% of our entire tenant is nothing more than a customized form wrapped around a SharePoint connector. No other connector, and it's basically just personal productivity for the individual user who created that custom form or for their extended team that uses the SharePoint site. We found other patterns like this, but SharePoint was by far the largest sample. So in this case, we're looking at SharePoint, but we're also looking for using other connectors other than SharePoint. The ability to send email may pose risk if the destination is outside of your tenant. Is it carrying sensitive data with it? There are legitimate use cases for sending data externally. The questions focus on the sensitivity of the message itself and not the email provider, although within Microsoft, of course, we use Outlook by default. We've encountered users that try to create custom connectors, use the Power Apps component framework, or other customizations. Our observations have been that in many cases, developers could have instead used built-in connectors or easily available samples in our documentation that accomplish the same thing without the customization. Downloading custom components built using the Power Apps component framework from internet source code hosting sites can be especially problematic. I denied the deployment of a PCF component from the internet as had nearly a meg of binary text that I could not decipher. So if the origin of these customizations is external to Microsoft, we're very hesitant to deploy them in our tenant. Even if it is just pure text and not anyone trying to slip some binary text in, it can be, it can require some careful examination on your part to determine if the component is going to introduce new risk or not. Regulatory compliance also comes into play. In our case, other internal tooling can be used as a source to determine if a given object is in scope for regulatory. It's not entirely deterministic, but it will increase the odds that we can automate discovery. So let's talk about implicitly shared connections. When you're sharing an app to a broad audience, you can inadvertently share the underlying connection with the same audience. They can create new apps or flows using that connection without your awareness, but this happens only in very specific cases. The audience has to have maker permissions in the environment with which you built the app or flow. If they can't create or update apps and flows in that environment, you're okay. The connection is authenticated to relational data sources without using Active Directory authentication. Specifically, in this case, using SQL connector with an on-premise SQL server using SQL authentication. This connection uses the credentials that you provided, not Azure AD, now giving anyone you've shared the app with the same access privileges you have and the ability to reuse your connection, again, without your knowledge. So how do you validate if this is an issue or not? You create it, in this case, and I'm showing here on screen, you create a new Canvas app, and then you go to the data sources and you look to see if any of the tables from your backend data source are exposed here and available for reuse within this Canvas app. Now, again, the solution here is if it is, you want to move to a custom environment and lock down access control so only a select set of people can create or update objects in that environment. Now, you can still share the app broadly from that custom environment, but because restrictions for being able to update and create new objects in that environment are locked down, you don't have to worry about this connection being accidentally shared. The easy advice is, of course, to use SQL authentication, but there are some cases, use Azure Active Directory authentication, but there are some cases where you do have to use SQL auth, but it should be avoided if at all possible. So I hope this has been helpful in understanding how to mitigate risk in the Power Platform and avoid oversharing risks. We've been talking about how we do things at Microsoft, both the things that we've driven into the product as well as some of our own internal processes. It's the first time we've presented this content on a broad scale, and I hope that you found it useful. Thank you.